Hello and a very warm welcome back to Muscles and Motors. As you'll have heard me say a million times before on this channel, Ford launched its Mark III version of the Fiesta in April 1989, and it quickly became a roaring sales success, jumping straight to the top of the sales charts for 1990 and 1991. But in the early 1990s, a raft of new superminis came along, all jumping at the Fiesta's coattails, trying to beat it. One of the first competitors that came to market was this, Peugeot's 106 in 1991. But does the Fiesta deserve the crown of Britain's best-selling supermini of the early 1990s, or is the 106 a better car? Well, I've got two very early examples of both of them here, both in base model form, which I think is the purest way to compare the two cars. So let's get going. Let's start then with the Fiesta, which was an all-new design in 1989, replacing the Mark I and the Mark II, which was essentially a facelift of that 1976 original. Crucially, the Mark III offered buyers something that the previous generations of the Fiesta did not, which is a 5-door body style, although admittedly this one is still the 3-door. In true Ford fashion, there was a myriad of trims from this base model Popular all the way up to a luxury gear, and there were even some sporting models, the S and later the XR2i. The Fiesta was based on an all-new platform which continued in various guises and modified form into the early 2000s with the Ford Ka. The Mark III Fiesta received a minor facelift in 1992 to bring the styling a little bit more up to date and to strengthen the body shell. It was finally discontinued in 1996, a year after in fact the launch of the Mark IV, and those final run-out models were badged the Classic. The 106 can date its platform back all the way to the launch of the Citroën AX in 1986 in France. But the body is all Peugeot and all new. It was launched in 1991, initially only in 3-door form, but very quickly 5 doors followed, and the motoring press were really very impressed. Technically, I would say the 106 falls into the class below the Fiesta. It's more of a city car than a supermini. Indeed, Peugeot's 205 was its offering in the full-size supermini class, and that remained in production, unbelievably, until 1997. Despite its diminutive proportions, the 106 was often pitted against the Fiesta in road tests back in the day, and it was still a very popular choice along with the Fiesta, particularly for first-time drivers. The 106 received its midlife facelift in 1996 and remained in production until 2003. That's a 12-year production run compared to the Mark III Fiesta's mere 7. Peugeot, of course, offered the 106 in various trim forms. This is the base XN, but it rose through the ranks to include things such as the Roland Garros even, which had leather seats and red seat belts. Very posh. The 106 also had a myriad of special editions, Aztec, Inca, Key West, Key Largo, to name just a few. They were all basically based on the base model with some tarted up graphics and slightly different seats. There was also a rally version, again basically based on the base model but with a more powerful, sportier engine available. I always think that this early base model really shows how the Peugeot 205 has clearly influenced the styling of the Mark III Fiesta. And the same indeed can be said of the 106, especially in this rear quarter. So that's the market and historical context of both of these base models, but what are they like to live with on a daily basis? Well, let's have a look around them both, starting with the Fiesta. I think it's certainly fair to say that in the 1990s, image and looks of a car suddenly started to gain great prominence, and certainly putting these two cars together, you can really tell that the Fiesta just looks that little bit more dowdy, it's a little bit more grown up, whereas the Peugeot is young, it's svelte, it's got pretty petite lines, and I'm sure that would have influenced buyers back in the day when making their choice. So overall, the Fiesta is a fairly pleasing but unexciting shape. It's mainly quite straight lines, but there are a few curves thrown in for good measure. On this base model, we get no side rubbing strips, we get very little in terms of any decoration or accoutrements whatsoever, and some very basic steel wheels with some centre caps. Taking our trusty standard Ford tube key, we put it into the lock, we turn it what I would always call the wrong way, and open the big plastic door handle. The big wide doors open to reveal a very grey vinyl door card, which admittedly by the time the 106 was launched had been slightly improved. There were some trim improvements on the base model. Turning to the 106 then, and we are greeted with a very pleasing little shape, aren't we? We've got this lovely little headlights that bend down into this nice grille and the Peugeot lion, giving a strong family resemblance to the 405 and the not yet to be launched 306. We've also got some stylish door mirrors, we've got a little swage line going across the middle there, but we don't have any side rubbing strips on this base model. We also have very basic steel wheels with some centre caps. To get into the 106, we take our very dinky little Peugeot key and we turn it in the lock the correct direction, and up pops the little telltale, which is something you don't get in the Fiesta. But what you don't get in the 106 is a proper door handle. You've got to actually use this little cutout slot and you have to put your fingers in there and operate this tiny little switchy catch thing up there, which you can only really do with your left hand on the driver's door. So if you're holding shopping or something like that, you've really got to sort of plan and put it down and swap hands. It's very irritating. Fully opening the door of the 106, it feels nice and solid and strong on its check strap, but it does reveal a lot of body coloured metal on this door, unlike the Fiesta, which is fully trimmed. We get some fabric on the door as well and a door pocket, although again, as I said, later Fiestas would have had a bit of fabric and a door pocket. The cabin itself is again overall very grey. I think that is a fair point to make. It is certainly of its time, very late 80s, grey was very fashionable. We've got Ford's controversial vacuum-formed foam seats, which I do think are very comfortable, but a lot of road testers at the time didn't like them for lack of side support in particular, and I suppose that is a fair criticism. The fascia of the Fiesta is a very blocky, very plasticky grey affair, isn't it? It's certainly a lot better and more refined than the Mark II Fiesta that came before it. But it is perhaps a little stuffy and a little fussy both at the same time somehow. Stuffy in that it's very boxy and angular. Fussy because there are a lot of buttons and controls at first glance, including this small radio with quite a few buttons to press on that as well. We have a two-spoke steering wheel with the minor controls placed on the stalks on either side of the lights and the wipers. The instrument cluster is neatly and simply laid out with just a speedometer and some warning lights, but I do very much like the always-on fuel gauge. On the floor we have a 4-speed manual gearbox and a conventional handbrake. Cabin storage is fairly generous with 2 big cubbies here. Later and posher models would have a lid on that glove box. There's also a cubby there which would have a clock for a more expensive model, and there's also a little cubby here down by the driver's knee. The rear view mirror arrangement does look very basic, almost looks like it's sort of a generic one that Ford have bought in, as does the courtesy light. It's pretty basic on a little rocker switch, and the headlining is also perhaps not the most stylish. The overall cabin view of the 106 is again fairly conservative, but it does seem just that little bit neater. Everything is just a little bit more stylised than in the Fiesta. We do get a lot of grey, but there is also some colour. There's colour in the carpets and colour in the body coloured metal that is on show. The 106's seats are trimmed in this really very funky fabric. If you have a little bit of a close-up, you can see that there's purple, there's yellow, there's a bit of red and a bit of green, lots of vibrancy, very 90s colours, I have to say. And these seats are really comfortable, I have to say. Even in 2025, you can do a very long, and I do mean 560-mile motorway journey in this car, as was done just a couple of days ago, and you can feel entirely refreshed and rested when you get out of it. You are not aching. They are excellent seats. Peugeot did a brilliant job. We have a simple plastic one-piece fascia, which is not a million miles away from the Fiestas, but I would say that the whole package here is just that little bit neater. We don't have quite so many lines and things going on as we do in the Fiesta. So if we look in the middle here, we've got some fairly simplified heater controls and stuff like that. It just doesn't look quite as busy and fussy as the Fiesta. We also, very excitingly, get a bespoke radio for the 106. It can't fit in any other cars, which is great for anti-theft, which was a big thing at the time. But I think it also fits so much more neatly into the dash, and so it all just looks far more coherent and far more modern, rather than sort of an 80s stereo plonked underneath the heater controls as you sort of get in the Fiesta. Similar to the Fiesta, the steering wheel is 2-spoke, but it is again perhaps a little bit more stylised. We also get some stalks either side for the minor controls, very similar to the Fiesta. Instrument cluster is big and simple with a huge fuel gauge, perhaps revealing that you did not spec a posh enough car to get a clock. Down on the floor we get a fairly stubby little gear stick with 5 speeds on it, but that's because this is the diesel. The petrol versions of the base model both got 4 speeds. Cabin storage is perhaps not as generous as the Fiestas. We get a sort of a T-shelfy thing there, and we get a glove box that does properly open and close, and like in the base model Fiesta. There's a tiny accoutrements tray there in front of the gear stick, but you don't get any knee storage, so there really is fairly limited cabin storage, apart from, of course, the door pockets. Other bits of the cabin are just that little bit more elegantly designed than the Fiesta. So we have a rear view mirror that does look like someone bothered to design it and is properly bonded to the windscreen as opposed to stuck on like the Fiesta's one. We've also got a nicely stylised courtesy light which rocks on the light itself. It's very cute, I love that. We also do get in this particular 106 a pop-up sunroof. It does also come completely out if you want to detach it, but that is actually pretty standard on the base model of a 106. Most of the base models were special edition graduates at this time, and most graduates, certainly 1.1 and 1.4 diesels, did get the sunroof. Access to the back is by lifting up this little handle here, which tips the seat forwards all the way like that and gives you a reasonable amount of space to get in there. Accommodation in the rear of the Mark III Fiesta is fairly spartan, with a light grey door card and only a single ashtray for excitement and entertainment. You do get a bench seat which folds down in the same fabric as the front vacuum formed seats. But you also get quite a lot of bare metal on show, body coloured metal, both in the C pillars and even the B pillars. Entering to the back of the 106 isn't perhaps quite as easy as the Fiesta, because you've got to search all the way down here to find the little lever to tip the seat forwards. But once it does tip forwards, you do get the advantage of being able to push the seat forwards all the way to give you as much access space as possible. So that is, I suppose, a benefit. Accommodation for rear seat passengers is just as basic as the Fiesta, although the door cards here, instead of being vinyl, are actually solid plastic, and on this side there is actually a little cubby hole that you can store some stuff in it. And interestingly, there is no ashtray in the rear on the base model, unlike the slightly more 80s Fiesta. Of course the bench rear seat does fold, but unlike the Fiesta, the squab comes up before the backrest comes down. Again, very similar to the Fiesta, we do get quite a lot of body coloured metal in here. Because this is a very dark colour, body colour, it's not perhaps quite as obvious inside the cabin as it would be if it was perhaps white or a bright red. A rear wiper was an option on early base models like this one, and the owner of this car did tick that. To get into the boot of the Fiesta, you have to get your key, which is one of my bugbears with it, I have to say, and stick it in the lock and give it a twist. It does open nice and high, easily, on its single, interestingly, gas strut. Note, not on the other side. And we get a fairly spacious boot. A lot of body coloured metal on show, of course. We have a bit of a felt sort of carpet, and again, this being a very early base, we don't get a parcel shelf, but most Fiestas would have had a parcel shelf fitted, even later base models did. There is, of course, a grab handle in the boot to aid its closing. Around the back we do get a rear wash wipe, which is standard on most base models apart from the 1 litre. But more importantly, we get an actual button so we can open our boot without needing the key. Oh my goodness, Ford, I wish you'd learn from this. Tailgate opens on 2 gas struts. This one has a parcel shelf. Base models always did on the 106, certainly in the UK. And we are greeted with, again, some body coloured metal on show. A little bit more trimming here going on than in the Fiesta, but then we have only a very simple vinyl boot floor as opposed to the slightly nicer felt that was in the Fiesta. And, shock horror of horrors, we don't get a grab handle. Sad times. Under the bonnet of the Fiesta reveals a very ordinary story of very conventional mechanics and quite a lot of space to make it very easy to work on. And it also perhaps reveals the Fiesta's Achilles heel. The engine is a very conventional overhead valve engine which can date its roots back to the 1950s. In much updated form here, of course, called HCS, high compression swirl, but it's still a tappety little engine that provides quite a lot of torque but not an awful lot of refinement. As you can see, this is the diesel version of the TU, but the petrol version, which powered most 106s, was essentially the same engine. The crucial point is that it was launched as an all-new engine in the mid-1980s, overhead cam style, which gave you far more refinement than the tappety old overhead valve in the Fiesta. In terms of purchase price, there really actually is very little between the two. I've got an issue of Car Choice here from 1992, which shows us that the base model of the Fiesta, which was available at the time, was 6,230, and the base 106 is 6,149, so really there is very little in it. Right, let's hit the road and see what these two little nuggets are like to drive. Well, what is the Mark III Fiesta like to drive on the road? Well, the overall impression for me is one of, I think, lightness of controls. So everything, the clutch is light, the brakes are decently light, the throttle response is good and doesn't require too much mashing of it, and the gear change is just light and delicate. It's not the most precise perhaps, but you really don't have to put very much effort to slot this into the various little cogs. It's really, really easy. And you can really see from that why they were so appealing for people back in the day, particularly people who perhaps weren't confident drivers, new drivers, learners, older people, that sort of thing. They are just very forgiving, very light and easy to use, very conventional. There's nothing about a Mark III Fiesta that's scary or difficult. The steering's also nice and fairly light, helped by the fact that it has really, really skinny tyres, and also that the gearing of the steering rack is such that really power steering isn't wildly needed for a Mark III. I suspect later ones with fatter tyres and heavier engines did, and so power steering was certainly an option at various points in the range. Cabin refinement isn't quite as good as the Peugeot. You can definitely hear some rattles and squeaks coming from the trim, and also the fact that this particular car doesn't have a parcel shelf means that a lot of tyre noise comes from the rear. That's not very damped. Yet a very pleasant place to be. Also, interestingly, it feels bigger than the Peugeot inside. It feels a little bit more spacious, and consequently, I think in some respects a little bit more grown up because you've got more space. So it does feel that slightly larger size of car than the city car the Peugeot is in. The fact that you have to rev this tappety little engine does make it feel very much more old-fashioned than the Peugeot. That sound takes you back to the 70s in a way that the Peugeot doesn't. The ride, I have to say, of the Mark III Fiesta is really very comfortable. It's very, very soft, very softly sprung, so it's nice and easy over the bumps. But the handling is perhaps not as sharp as the Peugeot. It doesn't grip the road as well as the Peugeot. It doesn't sort of ride as flat, it rolls a bit more, and therefore it doesn't inspire quite as much confidence as the Peugeot does in its abilities to kind of take you down the road on a twisty bend, for example. Personally, I find these seats perfectly comfortable. They're not as cosseting as the ones in the Peugeot. The foam is perhaps a bit softer, it doesn't quite support you in the same places, but they're nowhere near as bad as the press made out in the early 90s as this sort of horrendous things that Ford had invented. They are actually perfectly fine. Overall, I think the Fiesta gives much more of a vibe of sort of more basic motoring. It was absolutely fine when it was launched in 1989 and was a huge step forward over the previous generations of Fiesta and also a lot of the other competition at the time. But I think by the early 90s things had moved on. Quality had moved on, refinement had moved on, and sort of customer demands had moved on. So really by sort of the early 90s, 92, 93 certainly, the Fiesta was really feeling quite left behind. There were things like the Punto had been launched, the Mark III Polo had been launched, and so those just brought Super Mini games so much further into the future and brought sort of luxury and refinement down to the Super Mini level. And I think the 106 was probably one of the first ones to do that. And so consequently, shall we go and see what that is like on the road in comparison to this? Well, driving the 106 is essentially everything you expect it to be. It is all those words that those 90s motoring journalists were so fond of using. It is supple, it is lean, it is comfortable, it is powerful, it's svelte, it's serene, it's all of those lovely words. It is absolutely delightful to drive. I cannot recommend the driving experience of a 90s Peugeot enough. The gear change of the 106 is lovely, it's nice and notchy, it slips into the gears nice and easily, and it's a lovely gear stick to hold as well. The only downside I have about the 106 is the pedal box. It's everyone's major gripe about it. It's very offset to the left-hand side, so you end up sort of twisting your legs a little bit, and it's not perhaps the most comfortable to use, but you do get used to it. Another negative point about the 106 is the steering is really quite heavy. There is no power steering available on the 106, certainly at this age. But yeah, the wide tyres give nice stability, certainly when you're cruising. It's really planted and just tracks straight and true. But the expense of that is that when you're parking, you really are sort of pop-highing your arms to get the steering to move. Cabin refinement in the 106 is so good. The road, engine and wind noise are so damped. You don't hear them anywhere near as much as you do in the Fiesta. It doesn't feel like as raw an experience, even though you've still got body-coloured metal on show. The ride, handling and refinement of this car are so much more modern than the Fiestas. Indeed, they are in a different league. Only when the Ford Ka and the next generation Mark IV Fiesta came along did the ride and handling of the Blue Oval Super Mini offerings even come close to matching what the 106 could offer. The seats are really, really supportive. The foam is quite firm, but it's just what you want. It keeps you kind of upright and taut, supports your shoulders. It's really good. My only criticism would be that I wish the headrests were a little bit higher. So what can we conclude after giving both cars a thorough look around and a good drive on the road? Which is best and which would I buy if I was in the market for a Super Mini back in about 1991 or 92? Well, a lot of it comes down to really what you are looking for out of a car. The Fiesta topped the sales charts for a number of years in the 1990s and was always a bestseller. The 106 didn't even come close to the top 10. So in a numbers game, the Fiesta clearly wins. But the 106, as you can hopefully see from this video, has an awful lot to offer and an awful lot to challenge the Fiesta and its supremacy. It's much more refined and it's much more modern feeling than the Fiesta. And also, there is the image issue, which I hinted at before. The Peugeot just has that sharper, chicer image, and that became so much more important in the 1990s. Indeed, the Ford launched the Ka or the Ka in 1996, and that was its attempt at being much more chic and stylish in the Super Mini or city car market, and they were incredibly successful with it. It was also very good to drive. But the 106 got there first. The 106 beat the Ka to market by 5 years and was an absolute game changer in terms of Super Mini refinement and driving pleasure. The Fiesta, of course, can't be ignored. It was Britain's best-selling car for a number of years and certainly Britain's best-selling Super Mini. It reigned supreme and it has extremely good bones. And to be honest, most people just wanted a car that went from A to B. It took you down the shops, it took you to the swimming baths, it took you to school, it took your granny to bingo. That's what most people want out of a car. But to those that wanted that little bit extra, that je ne sais quoi, then the 106 was an incredibly good, solid choice. It gave you a much more driver-focused and much more modern-feeling package. Well, there we are. I hope that you've enjoyed this little look around both these 1990 Super Minis. Personally, I love them both. They represent quite different things. The 106 is sort of elegant and refined and a very good motorway cruiser even now. And the Fiesta represents a particular age of Ford where sort of basic was a real poverty underseller, and I really love it for that. Things like the lack of the door mirror really kind of excites me. But there we go. All that remains for me to say is thank you very much indeed for watching, and join me again in another video where we look at some other cars that are probably quite similar to these, to be honest. Bye.